people from across the country and really be focused on how we build an inclusive and resilient democracy. So thanks for being here. This season, we're going to focus on trust and participation, and we'll bring key topics to you and apply a practitioner and community builder's lens throughout. So I think what we all know is that the last 48 hours have really felt dizzying, and we're all lost in thought about the outcome of the US election, what it all means, and what will happen when Donald Trump takes office in 2025. Today, we're really coming together to focus on election interference, but I will say one thing. For some, the outcome of this election feels like a triumph. I think for others, it's devastating. So people are having very different experiences, and many are feeling uncertainty on a deep and visceral level. So what I would say is that we have to meet one another with care, with respect, and with a commitment to understanding these different and disparate perspectives, as long as they're not prejudice or rights abusive. So I would ask us all to meditate on the fact that a healthy democracy rests on inclusion and connection as we go forward. As we know, it's been a historic year for elections around the world, and right here in Canada with the BC election just having occurred as well. And we're really seeing the news unfold that we're also seeing the news unfold. The Canadian government has just announced a ban on TikTok operations in Canada on the advice of Canada's security community. So let's all watch for more on that as the story unfolds too. I'm really excited to welcome our brilliant guests, who include David Salvo, Managing Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund, Catherine Corriveau, our very own National Manager of Engagement here at the Exchange, and Adam Barnes, the Election BC's Director of Investigations. And I'm going to welcome them in a moment, but first I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually. You may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit territory. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we're on today and to reflect on their importance. We must continuously work hard to understand the long history of these lands and recognize what those histories mean for the work of truth and reconciliation ahead of our shared work around democratic engagement in our communities. Land acknowledgements really encourage us to think about the history that brought each one of us to where we are today and to try to understand our place within that history. So I really do encourage all of you to take the time to learn about the lands you're on and call home, and think about what you're personally doing to advance reconciliation in Canada. So now I'd like to actually welcome our guests to our virtual stage. So Dave, Catherine, and Adam, thanks so much for being here. How are you doing today?
Good. It's an exciting week.
What a week here in Washington, D.C.
Imagine. And Adam, how are you doing?
Sorry, I was having a little trouble getting unmuted there. No, I'm doing great. Beautiful out here on the West Coast in Victoria.
Well, thanks for being here. And for our audience, as you can see, we've made a bit of an international and cross-border conversation here for you today, so we can really get a sense of what's going on. But we also want to see how you're feeling too. So Ashley, my colleague, is going to put up a quick poll right now. And the question that we all want all of you to weigh in on is, are you worried about foreign interference in North American elections? So we'd love if you're able to weigh in and just get a sense of where people are at today. So I can see the data is already telling us that about 60% of you say you're very worried, and about 44% of you are saying somewhat worried, and about 5% are saying not at all. So I think that's thank you for your investment and for being willing to give us your thoughts today. So Dave, I'd really like to come to you first, especially given everything's going on this week. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your work and help us understand what foreign interference really is and how you work with Canada on this issue on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, so thanks again for having me, Victoria, and thanks to everyone who joined. Looking forward to the conversation over the next hour. So I run an initiative called the Alliance for Securing Democracy. We're based at a transatlantic think tank called German Marshall Fund, and we analyze foreign nation state efforts to destabilize democratic institutions, democratic elections, and democratic societies. From our perspective, the whole notion of foreign interference means that there are state-sponsored actors involved. Now, there may be domestic actors in all of our countries who are either wittingly or unwittingly abetting those nation-state operations, but we are sort of singularly focused on what adversarial or honestly sometimes friendly governments are doing to interfere and influence how we vote, how we think about political and societal issues. And we tend to look at threats that we define as asymmetric. And what we mean by that is that they are sort of subkinetic. They are not military threats. They are not even necessarily sort of traditional intelligence, like espionage operations, although they can be. But we're looking at things like mis and disinformation. We're looking at money flows. We are looking at the subversion of authentic and organic civil society groups in our countries. These are the types of operations that we define as interference operations. And we do everything from track and monitor these threats from countries like Russia, China, and Iran, and others, to developing policy strategies for national governments, both the American government, the Canadian government, European governments, but also at the sub-national level, state, local, which governments and officials who are sort of increasingly in the crosshairs of these types of operations. And we work very closely with civil society groups all across the transatlantic community, forming partnerships to build resilience among citizenry to this sort of activity so that when it happens, it doesn't have the effect that it had, say, in 2016 during our presidential election here when Russia interfered. So that in a nutshell is what we did. And Victoria asked about, what's Canada's role and how do we work with Canada? Well, Canada is an established democracy, just like my country is, and many of our allied nations are. And therefore, Canada, too, is sort of in the crosshairs of a lot of these operations from hostile governments, and not always hostile governments, but governments who have an agenda in your country. And your last two election cycles have been fraught as well. Like you don't need to hear it from me that China in particular has been targeting specific ridings in your elections, trying to influence how certain Canadian groups vote and think about sensitive issues. That's no different than what happens in my country, specifically with Russia and Iran as primary vectors of that sort of activity. India, there's been the whole diplomatic row with India over the assassination of, Sikh leader, and that's like that is I would categorize that as an interference operation as well. It's not an election-related interference operation, but it is foreign interference in Canadian civil society. So that sort of captures how we see the issue. We work with Canadians, in the context of partnerships like this, but also in the context of partnerships with government institutions like the Ministry of Democratic Institutions and other organs of the Canadian government who have a vested interest in democratic resilience in your country. We do a lot of sharing of best practices across the democratic space. That can be borrowed and applied in the Canadian or American contexts to build resilience in communities across our countries. So I've gone on too long. That's what we do. That's who we are. It's how we see the issue of foreign interference.
No, that's perfect, Dave. Thank you. And what I really appreciate is that right from the beginning of this conversation, you're really grounding that the work is done in a whole of society and on an international level and a whole of society approach, which, as we'll get to, is really particularly what's needed to be able to counter all of this kind of work. So I think now to the kind of hot topic of the moment, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about your sense of what's been going on in the US election. And I'd like to do that by sharing a quote from the executive editor, Brian Barrett at Wired, who commented, "If you're baffled by how Trump won so big, one reasonable explanation, and the one that Democrats will have to confront head on, is not that millions of voters are trapped in echo chambers and filter bubbles and scrambled by misinformation. It's that they've seen Trump for who he fully is and voted." So my question for you is, what do you think of that based on your current assessment? To what extent was election interference an issue in this recent election in the US?
So I'll get to the election interference piece second, but first, the whole notion of echo chambers, like that is how people sort of dismiss what they see in front of their face and are willing to make choices that are potentially against their own personal interests. I do believe that our information space has become so polluted that many people simply just don't trust anything that they read other than what they consume in those echo chambers. And oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes in those echo chambers, there are strands of mis and disinformation that go viral that shape how people think and ultimately vote. So I would push back against that contention. I actually think that that mis and disinformation plays a large role in election outcomes, and it certainly shapes how people think about sensitive topics in our societies. So that's first. The second thing I would say about election interference specifically is the only reason why we're not talking about it right now is because it was a blowout here in the United States. But I can assure you that if the election in the States had been close, you had tens of millions of Americans who were prepared to dismiss the integrity of the process as fraudulent and rigged against Donald Trump, because there has been a viral strain of election integrity related misinformation about how election administration is conducted in my country. And had the margin of the vote been razor thin, you can be sure that we would be talking about election integrity related misinformation today on this call. And we are not, because the result was beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? I mean, enormously so. So I do think that election interference matters, and it's both a domestic sort of homegrown problem, as it certainly is in my country, and you have nation state actors that are actively amplifying those strains of thinking in our countries. And Russia is sort of the primary threat vector here, but you had the Russian state propaganda apparatus and security services pumping out and amplifying, claims of voter fraud on the eve of the election. Like, that's not by accident. And
Right.
they would be doing that right now if we were still counting votes. So, I do think that election interference is a real problem. It is a threat. And it may not necessarily change an outcome of the vote. I wouldn't even argue that it changed the outcome of our 2016 election, despite the sort of all-encompassing nature of the Russian interference operation. But it is an insidious threat. You have foreign governments actively trying to destabilize our electoral process and undermine our confidence in that process, so that we can elect our leaders freely and fairly, so that democracy is tarnished, and so that, in best case scenario for them, we end up in the streets fighting each other, actually fighting each other, physically fighting each other.
As we saw 4 years ago, and thankfully it didn't come to that this time. I think that's really helpful for us to continue to deepen our understanding. I guess one question I have for you is, haven't governments been interfering in elections forever? Is this new, or is it, to what extent is it more of a hot button topic than before? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt election interference has been a problem for a while. And to be perfectly transparent, it has been conducted by democratic governments as well. So, my country has a very inglorious history during the Cold War of interfering in other countries' elections. And I think it's important to recognize that and acknowledge that history. But I also think we've learned less important lessons. Not only do we sort of cede the moral high ground when we conduct operations like that, but we're not very good at it, and we will destabilize whole regions of the world as a result. And so it's not even in our interests to wage those sorts of operations. Now you have authoritarian governments that obviously have been waging these campaigns as well. The Soviet Union did it. Post-Soviet Russia has been doing this in Europe for many years. What's changed is the technology, the speed, the access, the pinpoints of society that they can target. That has all changed, right? And it is continuously changing. Before it was bots and trolls and Twitter, right? In 2016, well, 8 years later, we're talking about AI generated images and audio and video, right? That's sort of the next generation threat. So the threat has metastasized. There are more threat actors involved. The technology has evolved. So the speed and scale of these operations, and the almost, you'll forgive me for the term, but the democratization of these technologies, like anyone can use it. And it doesn't have to be just hostile governments. It could be
Right.
your everyday Joe sitting in someone's basement, or a friendly government that has an agenda, wants to, target certain parts of the Canadian electorate. Like, this is all possible now on the cheap. It's low risk, high reward. So yeah.
So I appreciate you're going from the what to the how, and I actually want to ask you a little bit more about that. I know that you recently co-authored a report called Democracy in the Crosshairs, 5 Key Trends Driving Foreign Interference in Democracy, which actually breaks down those trends that have shaped foreign interference and the threat landscape more broadly. I'm wondering if you can talk us through those 5 key trends a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. So, and I'll try to do it as briefly as possible. But the first is that the primary threat actors are more aggressive than ever. They're more brazen, right? You have Russia, China, and Iran in particular that are significantly engaged in these types of malign influence operations, including increasingly like actual kinetic uh, operations like targeted assassinations, which you as Canadians know something about, and it wasn't necessarily one
We
of those
do.
3 countries, right? So there's an increased brazenness in this activity by the primary threat actors. There are also more threat actors than ever before. More nation states are involved in this. India has been accused of engaging in this activity in Canada. In my country, even purported allies like the United Arab Emirates have been accused of engaging in this activity. Israel has been accused of engaging in this activity against Americans. So there are just simply more nation states who are trying to do this. And there are more domestic actors using these tactics. Mis and disinformation being the obvious one, but there are also cyber tools like ransomware, which are readily available to non-state actors as well. And then, of course, I referenced this already, the technological boom, where there are all these readily available tools to facilitate malign influence or foreign interference operations at speed and scale like never before. And AI is sort of the accelerant of existing technologies, but it's certainly not the only threat vector. We focus a lot, in fact, on a tactic called information laundering, which is not necessarily an AI generated or a tactic that exploits AI, although it can, but it takes advantage of things like search engine optimization. So if the Russian state media wants to ensure that its propaganda is reaching Canadians in the top 3 Google and Bing search results, it can do this in a variety of ways. It can create proxy sites, and there are for-profit content launderers that then surface this content ad nauseum, including on social media platforms. And because of that volume, it materializes in top search results. And now more Canadians are consuming Russian propaganda without knowing that it's Russian propaganda. So there are all these sort of clever tactics that are being used in ways that they weren't being used even, say, 8 years ago. Money is the other sort of, this isn't a surprise, but money's fueling all these operations. And there are many policy vulnerabilities in our countries that facilitate the moving of money from hostile countries into our political systems, often legally through shell companies and the like. And that's the real sad thing, that we are abetting this and encouraging this activity through our own sort of policy mistakes. And then the final thing I'll mention is there really is a concerted effort to destabilize our societies. It's not just about who wins and loses a specific election, although that is of importance to these nation state actors because there are real policy implications involved. But it's about ensuring that Canadian democracy is tarnished and American democracy is tarnished. And the reasons they're twofold, really. One is for domestic political purposes. In these authoritarian countries, they need democracy to look bad to justify their own regimes to their own people. But from a geopolitical perspective, if we are consumed by our own domestic turmoil, then we are ceding leadership on the global stage on issues of importance to these countries like Russia and China. So those are the 5 sort of dominant trends that we are noticing in the foreign interference space over the last few years.
I think that's really helpful, but I also think it's quite overwhelming to hear, right? Because it's highly effective. It's affecting people on the ground. It's affecting the nature and the quality of the information we take in. But what I really want to reassure our audience is that, there are things we can do. There are really good resources. There are ways we can educate ourselves and others in amongst all this pollution, quite frankly, that I think can help to de-victimize us and help keep our democracy strong and safe. And I think, so thank you, Dave. And I'd like to bring it home now to Canada a little bit and turn to Catherine. So Catherine, we know that the exchange has actually really been at the forefront of helping us understand how the local can really be a vector through which we can safeguard communities and build resilience and strength around our democracy when it comes to interference. And I know that you co-designed a report called Responding to Foreign Interference and Disinformation in Canada's Election, by really kind of instrumentalizing a whole of a society approach and bringing in different people into a workshop. So I would love for you to give us a bit of a baseline understanding around that workshop, around election interference in Canada, and really just let us know what some of the takeaways and call to actions were there.
For sure. And thank you so much, Dave, for doing this scene setting. I think it's important that we understand the sort of theory behind everything that we're thinking about today. But to Victoria's point, it's quite overwhelming. And I think a lot of people, Canadians, like regular Canadians, but also institutions that are dealing with the sort of consequences of foreign interference and disinformation, find it quite difficult to navigate this like big scary thing that foreign interference is. And so in June, for context, we held a workshop that was meant to diagnose critical issues, share best practices, and propose solutions, and sort of galvanize coordinated action to fortify Canada's defenses against these threats. So we gathered a bunch of very smart people who work across sort of the field in terms of combating foreign interference, from people who are working directly in elections, security agencies, our tech platforms, some academics, but also our community organizers and sort of civil society leaders who are dealing directly with their communities, their people being impacted by this foreign interference. Before I go into the sort of findings and key challenges and recommendations from the workshop, I'll just say, like, for us at the Exchange, it's so important that we always go back to the Canadians and go back to our sort of regular people who don't get the time to think about all of this and who won't have access to sort of the who did what and the secret information that is, you know, in the sort of ivory tower of our parliament or even our security agencies. And, you know, they're getting all these news and it's kind of scary and overwhelming. And for us, it's really trying to find ways to equip these Canadians to feel empowered in responding and protecting their own democracy. So I'm not going to have any findings about exactly what happened, but rather thinking through like very actionable ways that us and, you know, a lot of people here on this call can work with their own communities to build up their resilience. So the consensus from this workshop, and by the way, so there's a report on this, so we're happy to share that afterwards, but was that one of the main problems around fighting foreign interference and disinformation in Canada is that there's a lack of concerted efforts and collaborations between sectors to build sort of a nationally cohesive strategy that are reflective of local, provincial, and territorial and national realities. So a lot of different actors might be working on fighting foreign interference, but there's sort of like a missing collaboration in the middle. And that's really creating a lot of roadblocks for folks who are trying to help their own communities. You know, some key challenges that we identified was that there's a lack of communication between sectors. So, for example, the tech sector might not be able to connect with the communities might not be able to raise some flags around foreign interference to their political representatives. The academics might have a bunch of research, but they don't necessarily know who to talk to sort of share best practices and some data around these issues. There's also a lack of national cohesive sort of clear standards around what foreign interference is that people can use and then integrate in their fight against foreign interference in Canada. And there's a need for better tools to differentiate, you know, actual political dialogue from our public or from our own politicians from state-backed disinformation campaigns. So there's a lot of muddy waters that people don't really know how to navigate, and that's really at all levels. There's also a lot of incentives for people to do nothing about foreign interference, right? Political parties might actually benefit from like a very polarized discourse that foreign interference and disinformation actually creates. And so, and the media also can sort of use that to get the clicks and to get more attention. So, you know, we need to be building out some incentives so that we're no longer engaging in discourse or giving sort of that foreign interference discourse a platform. And then the other big one is a capacity issue. So I think we all hear about foreign interference at the federal level. There's a big, commission happening, and we all know about the sort of political fighting that's happening in Ottawa. But the truth is, at the provincial and the municipal level, there's a lack of consistent resources for the different bodies, whether that's election management bodies or civil society groups. And like, a lot of people know that it's happening and know that it's a problem there in their communities or the groups that they serve, but they don't have the tools needed to fight it. So just recognizing that, and also the fact that some communities are really disproportionately targeted by the foreign interference, and they might know it, but they don't necessarily feel equipped to react to it. And then the last thing actually that I'll mention is what you were talking about, David, is that, with AI, with sort of rapidly changing technologies, we're constantly sort of reacting and reimagining how foreign interference and disinformation even happens. And so there's these like mega catalysts for these threats to become quite pervasive in Canada. And we're not really reacting at a speed that matches theirs. So that's, a very significant issue. So in terms of recommendations, the first thing is really focusing on building out strong pathways for cross-sectoral collaboration. So ensuring that people feel like they can talk to each other, they can work. If you're a security agency, you're able to talk to the tech platforms. If you're a small election management body, you're able to, tap into federal funding to build up your capacity to fight disinformation. If you're a community group, seeing that there's foreign interference happening within your community, who to call. There's like a phone line that you can tap into and really react. There's a need for a national cohesive strategy where we're identifying roles, responsibilities, and pathways to response. So, some ideas that came up was creating a national cross-body, cross-jurisdictional, and cross-sectoral centralized body to pool that high level of expertise and create really clear pipelines and national guidelines around escalation pathways, so that people can not only recognize what is happening, but they're able to do something about it. And then create those feedback loops and sort of open source access to information, so that folks are able to, constantly reassess and evaluate how these threats are impacting their communities. Another one was really focusing on fostering political commitment from political parties, but also anyone really engaging in public discourse, to recognize and prioritize disinformation and foreign interference as threats to democratic integrity. And so moving away from like a pointing fingers policy, but really like seeing how everyone has their own role and how they can model actually a practice where that disinformation, that foreign interference isn't something that they're actually going to be using for their own political gain or their clicks or whatnot. The next one would be around encouraging and incentivizing platforms to create accessible reporting processes and really contributing to that whole digital literacy education. So tech platforms, are often blamed for a lot of the problems that are happening, but really they're just a tool where it might be happening. And so they have, the infrastructure to help Canadians build their own resilience as they think about, what they're consuming, what they're seeing, and how they interpret it. So really encouraging platforms to take their own leadership role there. And then finally, really back to the community, identifying and prioritizing the most vulnerable groups in Canada, being there and supporting them and giving them a sort of clear pathway so that they can report what is happening within their groups. Additional funding for organizations doing this work. There's some really awesome groups doing media literacy work and some community resilience efforts. And so they need more support, because I think everyone's just working on super limited budgets. And that's a big struggle that community organizations deal with. And they're always being asked to come and speak and give their opinion and everything. But at the end of the day, their first goal is to serve their community, and they need more capacity to be able to deal with these like very overwhelming threats. Investing in localized and very culturally sensitive educational resources is also important, because at the end of the day, Canadians aren't really thinking about this in their daily life, but they're, they're consuming content, they're reacting to things. And so if we can meet them where they're at, as opposed to sort of prescriptively telling them, well, you should be worried about all these things, but really finding where they're already participating, that would be very, I think, productive in ensuring that we're equipping Canadians to be empowered in their own sort of fighting disinformation and foreign interference capacity. So those are the key challenges. That's a lot, I know, but there's a lot of opportunities, I think, here.
Thank you for that, Kat. That was really in depth, and I think it helped us really understand what's going on within Canada here, and really what came out of bringing all those kind of parties together. I think one thing I want to drill into a little bit more is exactly what this season is looking at, which is trust and participation. I think what we heard from both you and Dave was that, there are long-term systemic effects here when it comes to the quality of information that everyday people like us are kind of experiencing online within their communities. There's, of course, local newspapers. And so I think the type of information that we're taking in, the kind of communication we have with one another, the decisions we're making, this all leads to a culture of either, evidence-based fact-based truth, and the way we collaborate, the way we get along, or the way we don't, and the way we work together. I'm wondering if you might want to meditate a little bit more on really the connection to trust and participation here, and what community leaders really need to be aware of as they're doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think no one will be surprised to hear that, we're experiencing a bit of a social fraying moment in Canada, and I think all around the world. And part of that, to your point, is that people don't really know who to trust. They don't really understand who's speaking for them and who's looking out for their interests. There's like a whole societal sort of question around that, but specifically around the foreign interference and disinformation element of that. I think, people need to feel confident that that they know what's going on in their own lives, and that they have an opportunity to make an informed decision about what's going on in their own lives. And feel confident that that decision will have an impact on, their general livelihood, their community, and so on. If people feel like the people who are there to serve them or to represent their interests aren't doing that, they will most likely not want to participate in the process that's supposed to be there to serve them. As we have these like foreign interference and disinformation campaigns that tend to really polarize the discourse around what is being done for Canadians, for example, or who the threats are within your own community. That really frays that trust and that impression that there's sort of like a clear pathway of me as a Canadian being able to engage in the process, and the process sort of giving me a result that matters to my life and helps me be, happy as a Canadian, but also feel like the system works. So when foreign interference and disinformation come and put some question marks around whether that system works, we really see a lot of disengagement and sort of feeling of disenfranchised like Canadians around the country, who just don't really feel like anything's working for them. So why would they participate in it? But I think that a lot of that has to do with the political actors as well, like their own responsibility. As we're learning more and more about where the foreign interference is happening and how it is happening in the communities and who's responsible for it, I think there's a lot of that education that political actors have to give their own communities, right? If you're a politician and you have your constituents, like you are responsible towards their sort of happiness and well-being. And so, there is that sort of education gap that they have to fill in some way, or at least, take their responsibility to recognize that, hey, maybe in this community, there's that threat that's kind of becoming a bit existential. Let me see what I can do about it by advocating for this community, in front of Parliament or City Hall or whatever it is that, they're wherever it is that they're sort of doing their work. So I think there's a bit of that feedback loop of people need to feel like the system's working for them. They need to trust that it works, and politicians need to, give them that trust back by doing the work for them. But, being very aware that the foreign interference and the disinformation goes right at the heart of fraying that trust.
I think you make some strong points there, Kat, and I wanted to couple that actually with I had shared in the chat for all of you, but the Government of Canada, I think, has some really solid resources and community toolkits for different segments. So there's one specifically for community leaders, there's one for public servants, and there's one for politicians. And I actually shared an excerpt in the chat for all of you of that really says disinformation can be hard to spot, but here are some common signs to watch for. And it's really about that self-awareness within yourself. What kind of emotional response are you having? Is it a high degree of like sensational news? Should you stop for a moment and like regulate those emotions and think to yourself, you know, what is this trying to elicit in me? And it's really about that personal empowerment you can do around moments like this. And I think that's what we're in control of right now. And I think that that's really important to be aware of. Adam, thanks for your patience. I'm really excited to turn to you now and like zero in even more closely on the BC election. So as the director of investigations, we're really excited to bring you into conversation, given that BC is just coming out of an election. So I'm just wondering, what is the data telling us about potential foreign interference in the BC election? And really, how do you identify and investigate and address it in your role?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. In terms of the data at this point, it's probably a bit premature for us to make any pronouncements on foreign interference or any identification of it at this point, without potentially just reading tea leaves and spreading disinformation inadvertently. But I can talk about what we do to identify it and how we're trying to address it in our role and in our role as an elections management body in BC. So in Canada, like until recently, election integrity perception of such could almost be taken for granted. There were really high levels of, and they still are, high levels of public trust, citizen trust in election management bodies and the election process. However, there's obviously some areas where this needs to be improved, and we need to be more proactive about taking steps to help improve these the election integrity piece. So there's kind of three main drivers that we look at. Foreign interference is one of them. Just general disinformation or misinformation is certainly one of them as well. There's either deliberate or unknowing spreading of false information about the election, and that can be about election processes, or it can be about candidates or campaigns, and some of that can be in the form of foreign interference. Some of it can be pretty domestic. It could just be misinformed people, it could be confused people, it could be people who simply don't trust the government. There's a fair number of those folks out there. There's also foreign interference, which is the clandestine, deceptive attempts to influence elections. It's obviously been a topic of intense scrutiny in Canada over the last couple of years. It includes aspects of unattributed foreign funding of campaigns or election advertising or influencing party nomination processes. And then the third driver is risks to election security, whether they're cyber threats or electoral systems, software networks, or physical threats against election workers. We have seen a bit of that through this election, unfortunately, where we have seen an increase in physical threats towards election workers. Overall, these threats—
That's really sad.
Yeah, it's a bit unfortunate. I think it shows there's a lot of people passionate about elections, which is good. Overall, these threats can hinder the delivery of election and undermine public trust, which makes it more important than ever for elections management bodies like Elections BC to protect the integrity of the process. So what do we do? Well, first and foremost, we look at this from a whole of society approach. I think, Victoria, you mentioned this, and it's really key to this situation. These challenges are broad, they're complex, they're evolving, and we have a role to play as the people who are running the elections and enforcing the election rules. But we're not the only ones involved here. And this has to be, spread out across a lot of different sectors of society. Political participants have a significant role to play here. We need them to be aware of the risks and that should take active steps to mitigate them. Malicious actors are aware of the key roles that political parties and candidates play in our democracy, and they can make them potential targets for foreign interference. Particular areas that they need to focus on and that we do encourage them to focus on are cybersecurity and risks to the nomination contest process. Party internal party nomination processes have been identified as potentially being vulnerable to foreign interference.
Hmm.
These are largely contests that are run within the party to figure out who's going to be the candidate for a particular riding or party leader, and they're pretty lightly regulated. So they're very much run by the parties themselves, and so they are potentially subject to foreign interference or
And quite
vulnerable.
closed door too, right? I think that this is one of the issues, that transparency, as soon as that is something that starts to erode, that's a unique vulnerability, right?
Yeah, and so the parties themselves and the political participants have a real active role that they need to play in preventing foreign interference and improving election integrity. And we do what we can to help. We facilitate communication between the Canadian Security Intelligence Services and the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity and the political participants. We've made sure that the participants in this election got access to them, and we're able to get briefings from them about risks, foreign interference, and how to make themselves a harder target or a less likely target. One of the things we do know about attempts to influence and interfere with political participants is it tends to start, depending on the political actor and depending on the nation involved, it can start pretty early, and it can start at relatively low levels with the idea that that person might end up moving up the political ladder from being a school board trustee to an MLA or an MPP.
I really appreciate what you said there about not being an easy victim. I think that, that's a really key role in what the citizenry and public servants and politicians can do. It's like, to what extent can you fortify and inform yourself and work together to not be that easy victim? I think that that's something that's a major, lots of the things that you shared, I think were really helpful in terms of how the process works and how we distill it. But one of our values is also to translate that back to community and back to that individual agency we talked about. So thank you for that. One follow-up question I have for you is, do you have any data around what demographics are often most targeted? I know that you shared that politicians and nomination processes are as well, but is there anything else that you would add there?
Yeah, my understanding from the briefings I've received, the most vulnerable segments tend to be the recent expatriate communities. That tends to be people, areas where there's still a lot of emotional connection to the other country. There's still family connections to the other country. There's still financial connections there, and so anywhere there's sort of those levers of power that a malicious actor can act on to kind of push for influence and trying to influence the election through that process. That tends to be where most a lot of the foreign interference that we've seen can be. It's in the recent expatriate community.
Yeah, I think a lot of my research has also shown me that similarly diasporic communities have often been targeted. And I think that one really interesting thing that came out of the workshop that Kat designed and Dave actually spoke about was the unique opportunity with the local diasporic presses here and journalists. And really one, I think, amazing opportunity is to treat those journalists like journalists and give them the press briefings, give them the press accreditation so that they can actually be exactly what journalists are meant to do, help to really distill, the truth of what's going on within our nation when it comes to elections and be able to report on it. So I think that's one pathway for what media can do as well.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of our kind of key pillars for the whole society approach is media and journalists, and making sure that they've been given the proper tools and the proper briefings and the information ahead of time on what the election's going to look like, how things are going to operate, and all that sort of stuff. One of the other ones is actually the educators and academics. Public education is widely seen as a tactic to mitigate risks and from disinformation and foreign influence, and helps to build kind of citizen resilience. Both through like the school system, but also the academics, and I think academics particularly connected with civil society organizations have a real distinct role to play in helping with fact checking and debunking misinformation and disinformation. We can proactively put out all of the correct information on our website, and we do. If you go to our website, we have a ton of information about the election process. both the tabulators we use and all the related stuff and common sort of disinformation things that we've seen. But if somebody doesn't trust us, and there are people who don't trust us, then there needs to be other voices out there, and the civil society and academics really have a strong role to play in supporting that kind of and debunking and fact checking process. And we've seen that actually really effectively applied in places like Taiwan and Finland, where there's really heavy foreign influence campaigns, impacting those election management bodies there.
I love that you talked about Taiwan there for a moment, because I saw Audrey Tong, the former digital innovation minister of Taiwan, come and speak about some of these issues, and actually talk about the important role that pre-bunking plays as well, and really shared that, while there's that opportunity to debunk, if you actually know that something's going to be in the information ecosystem, you can address it by saying, this may come out on social media in, the next little while. We actually want to address this and say that this is the accurate information. And so I think that that's a really interesting notion as well, to anticipate and be proactive and offensive about these things. I have one question that I can't believe we're almost out of time, which is crazy. And some questions are coming in from the chat, but I do want to maybe ask Dave this next question and then pose it to both of you. So Dave, would you say that foreign interference takes shape similarly in the US to Canada, or from your cross-border work, do you think we experience unique incidents? And what do we need to be mindful of to really help mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are similarities and differences. The similarities are not necessarily specific to elections themselves, but Canada is very much the target of mis and disinformation operations from foreign actors on a daily basis. And that is no different than it is in the States or elsewhere in the democratic world, because we're easy targets. We have open societies and freedom of speech and platforms that allow for this sort of activity. And there are polarizing topics that our adversaries know about, and it's easy. The foreign actors don't create those problems; we create those problems. Canadians had the trucker convoy, for example, right? That wasn't a foreign influence operation, but you did have foreign actors try to amplify mis and disinformation across numerous social media platforms around the truckers convoy, for example. So in that regard, I think what happens in Canada is the same as what happens here in the States and elsewhere in other established democracies. What's different, I think, is how foreign threats have manifested in specific elections. In Canada, I think the hyper focus on specific groups and specific writings, that has been a bit different here than has happened in the States, where there were specific slices of the American electorate that were targeted in 2016. For example, the African American community was the target of many Russian intelligence operations during that campaign, but it was sort of nationwide in many respects. Whereas in your country, China in particular has targeted specific nomination processes or actual elections in specific races, and that is not really happened in the United States. The focus has been the presidential election, and obviously it's a much wider scope than targeting a specific MP race. So the tactics are again similar and different. There's disinformation that has happened on like WeChat, for example, targeting Chinese Canadians. That's no different than what happens in the United States. There's disinformation targeting Americans in various social media platforms. There's money flowing into both of our countries from nation state actors to, for political purposes. That's not different. But again, it's it's the activity that, like busing people to the polls, for example, like that has not, to my knowledge, happened in the United States, but that is something that has happened in Canada, allegedly. So, those are differences. But the broad strategies, the broad tactics, I think, remain similar across the democratic space.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Dave. Adam, I'm wondering wondering what your thoughts are on, kind of cross-border similarities and differences. But most importantly, we do a lot of work with electoral management bodies here, and I know that you do as well, obviously, in your role too. And I'm just wondering what advice you might have for other, as we call them, EMBs, especially ones that might be smaller and be less resourced as well, but still have that unique responsibility and are staying vigilant to these threats.
Yeah, in terms of the cross-border similarities, I think Dave's right. I think there are a lot of similarities between the two. I actually think we have a bit of a rain shadow effect in running the BC election at the same time as the US election, where there's always limited resources in any government agency, including any intelligence agency, and if they're going to focus their energies on any particular area, it's probably during that time is probably going to be the American election. So we probably benefit a little bit from that, to be perfectly honest, when we're running provincial election concurrent with the US presidential election. But that's not to say that we're not of interest. There's definitely areas and definitely national intelligence services that are interested in our election and interested in influencing it. Sorry, Victor, I missed the second part of your question.
That's okay. That's always, that's a failing of the moderator to ask two at once. So the question I have for you is, as you work, systemically with other election management bodies, I'm just wondering what advice you have, especially when they may not be as large a province and may, not be as resourced as some of the other larger provinces.
Yeah, thanks for the reminder on that. Yeah, the advice I give is to try and maximize the relationships you've got with federal colleagues and other provincial colleagues. One of the things that we did in BC this year for the first time was set up what we call the Election Integrity Working Group, and that is a kind of broad collection of agencies that included, basically was bringing together a lot of the partnerships with federal agencies and making them more formalized. So we brought in obviously Elections BC. We chaired the committee. We brought in the Office of the Police, the Information Privacy Commissioner, who sort of manages privacy and also does the lobbyist registry. We brought in the Office of the Chief Information Officer, who's the cybersecurity guardian, basically, for BC government. And we brought in the Office of the Deputy Minister to the Premier, who, if we ever needed legislative change, is the person to go to get it done quick. And we also brought in the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, who is sort of the public-facing arm of the Communication Security Establishment, so sort of the Canadian version of the NSA. And we brought in the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the Canadian version of the CIA, and the RCMP. And we all kind of, they're the RCMP's national security, federal security team. So we all kind of sat down at the table and discussed different levers of power, basically who does what in the foreign interference world. So if we do come across something, we know where to refer it to, and they know where to refer it to if it's something that relates to our matters. And just have that kind of lines of communication set up as much as possible ahead of time.
That's really helpful. And I think, we keep coming back to the same solution, right? Which is a cross-collaborative approach from different elements of different ecosystems. And really, I think no one body can do it alone. And I think that's a really important model for us to go forward with, that kind of co-design, co-solutioning model.
It's not just a whole of society, it's a whole of government.
Exactly. Pat, quick question for you. And then I want to make sure we get to the question we have here from our audience member. Is, in this work of translating why everything matters, why democracy matters, why does foreign interference matter in our local communities and their daily lives? I'm just wondering if you can help us break down a little bit what democratic values are really at play here and have to be kept in mind when it comes to responding to foreign interference. And Dave and Adam, I'd like to get you to do a quick, like a rapid fire round on your sense of that as well. But Kat, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, there's like the very essence of democracy is this sort of idea of like free will, of choice, and being able to choose what you want for yourself and for your community and for your country in this case. And so when you're thinking about foreign interference, so people who are actively trying to prevent you from being able to make that informed decision, and therefore like taking away in some ways like your power as like a citizen in a country. That's kind of baseline what we're dealing with. And I think this is why, without being alarmist, we really need to start thinking about how this becomes a bit of an existential threat to our democracies, because these are people who are active, people, states, actors, whatever, who are actively trying to prevent us from using the system that is meant to serve us. So in that sense, I think, it's very foundational to what a democracy is. When we have actors who are going and intruding into our private lives, and sort of wire our brain to think one way or another, that like this is like basic privacy, sort of elements that are being disrupted as well. So there's the idea that you're fraying societies on purpose, and then you're trying to create sort of tensions and remove sort of access to reliable information and so on. Like all of those are very basic tenets of democracy, but I think that's why I think it's become so important. And I'll just add like quickly, because our job is to do knowledge translation, like the reality is like a lot of Canadians don't really care about foreign interference or don't feel like this is relevant to them, because it's so difficult to understand. But if I told someone that someone was actively, specifically targeting them and trying to get them to change their mind, and I was bringing it back to a reality that they understood, and saying, oh, someone's trying to manipulate you and trying to make you think one way instead of the other, or trying to make you believe these things that aren't true, like that's a whole different conversation. So I think like as we think about our community leaders and even our government agencies who are doing God's work to get the word out, like we really need to find ways to understand, like at a very basic human level, like what this means for Canadians, because until that is understood, and it's understood that this is like a very existential, and like a lot of the issues that we're facing in our society right now are, as derived from these sort of tensions, it's only going to get worse. And again, I don't want to be like an alarmist or a pessimist, but I think community,
but it's a pressing issue, right?
Need to recognize that and empower themselves and their communities to recognize that and address that, and ask for like better resources, ask for better responsiveness from the different government agencies, the different political agencies, and so on. So as we do this cross-sectoral, whole of society collaboration model, there needs to be that urgency, I think, as we move forward.
I think that's very helpful. And Dave, I'm actually going to instead pose a question to you that came in through our chat box, and maybe you can think about that value piece as well. So it's a really good question. Actually, it says, how can we effectively reach and convince people who are deeply immersed in close communication platforms like WhatsApp, where they're receiving that mis and disinformation from sources that they trust, like friends and family? For example, despite factual information, some people, including my own family members, remain firmly rooted in their beliefs, choosing to trust circulated misinformation over credible news sources. So what approaches and what advice do you have?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the $1 million question, and I don't have a satisfying answer to it, but I think increasingly we're going to have to rely on non-traditional partnerships between official sources of information and trusted leaders in those closed communities to be able to disseminate actual factual sources of information. So, I think community leaders in that regard play a hugely important role, but it's also incumbent on the EMBs of the world and the think tanks of the world and the government bodies of the world and the platforms of the world to find those points of connectivity with these community leaders who are trusted in these very closed communities, to be able to spread, here's how you vote, I'm sorry, not here's how you, like, here's where you go to vote, or here, the date that you go to vote, or here's a news article that is actually, factually verified. I think it's going to take that, and this is a long game, right? This isn't going to solve this overnight, but I think increasingly we're going to have to find those alliances that maybe we traditionally would not have thought of, to be able to break through the sheer volume of mis and disinformation that people are encountering in these closed in circles.
I think that's a perfect way to end our dialogue today. So first of all, I want to thank our panel so much for taking the time and being so generous in their expertise and sharing it with us. I think we heard a really strong call to action from the audience. Write into us with your ideas and your challenges so we can help you work through them. And I also want to call out that in December, the public inquiry into foreign interference in federal elections, federal electoral processes and democratic institutions will come out, so that this conversation is timed intentionally so that you can be thinking about your own intervention as you read what's happening in the country. And so from all of us here at the Exchange, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you at the next Democracy Dialogue. Take care.